Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading Patricia St. John Tells Her Own Story by Patricia St. John with permission of 10 of Those Publishing Company, and we are reading Chapter 22, Lebanon. In 1976, I came back to England and have made it my base ever since. During the first 4 years, my aunt, Miss Swan, and I lived with my brother John, his wife, and family in their beautiful home in Coventry. Auntie had lost her flat and all her possessions in the fire at Clarendon, where she had been living since her retirement, but had taken her losses very bravely. My sister-in-law, Gwen, helped me to care for her, and I took turns in helping John in the surgery. His Parkinson's disease was rapidly getting worse, and he could no longer write his prescriptions and certificates legibly. His patients loved him dearly, and many sad stories were poured out in a short time available. I often deplored the lack of time to talk and listen to their problems, and I dreamed of a surgery with a full-time counselor available to any distressed patient, and in the background a voluntary team of Christian visitors and prayer partners, an unofficial arm of the church. Perhaps there are others who share this dream and are even now bringing it to pass. I only know from my experience that some of those who come to the doctor's surgery are often in real need of spiritually and wide open to what the gospel has to offer, if one only had the time to tell them. It was a sad time watching John become progressively weaker and more weary, yet struggling bravely on. It was also a happy time, greatly enriched by the kindness and friendship of my sister-in-law and the nephews and nieces who still lived at home or who often visited, 7 of them all together. The time passed quickly, but in September 1978 a family crisis arose which altered my pattern. My sister Hazel, who had gone to Beirut at 22 with the Lebanon Evangelical Mission, now at Medco, after getting her degree and teaching certificate, had now survived the first 3 violent years of the Civil War. But she had slipped on the road in West Beirut one Sunday morning and broken her femur. 2 passing lads assured her that they could drive her, and there being no one else in sight and her car some 50 yards away, she hoped for the best and gave them the key. Fortunately, all went well. They took her to the nearby home of her friends Colin and Ann Chapman, who got her to the American hospital, but they were not going to attend to her until a large sum of money was produced by the mission. Most of the doctors were off duty and ill, and it was about 9 p.m. before anyone could attend to her. However, the operation went well in the end, and 4 substantial pins were inserted and still safely in place today. She had to stay in the hospital only a week, surrounded by many visitors and much kindness. Then after another week of convalescence, she was back in her flat on the 5th floor of the school, eager to start the new term on crutches quite happily for the next 6 months. The flat above had had a direct hit. The water was seeping through, and her books and walls showed signs of passing bullets. But cheerful as ever, she managed to call me, and feeling quite sure that she could be all right, and that I ought not to leave Auntie, she advised me not to come. However, my sister-in-law assured me that she could manage, and as I walked across the Godiva Square in Coventry, I knew it was right to go. I went straight to the travel agent, who assured me there was plenty of spare seats on the next flight to Beirut, as it was not a popular resort at that point. I left within 2 days and arrived at Beirut Airport late at night without having been able to get through on the phone to say I was coming. By the dim light of a few lamps, I could see the heavily armed soldiers all around. There were guns everywhere, and the taximan wanted £30 to drive me to the school, which I knew was quite near. When I wanted to know why, he pointed an imaginary gun at me and said, "Pop, pop, pop." Apparently, the direct route was too dangerous. I eventually found a more reasonable taximan, who deposited me at the school gates. They were locked and barred, and it took me a great deal of banging and shouting to attract the attention of Yusuf, the gatekeeper. At first he was extremely suspicious, but when he knew I was Hazel's sister, his delight knew no bounds. He had a high sense of drama. He insisted that he would go up first and say there was a visitor, and then, having aroused the curiosity of Hazel and the boarding staff with her, he would come down and produce me. It was a tremendous success, and Yusuf went off chuckling, feeling no doubt that he had organized the whole visit. Hazel had become the head of the Lebanon Evangelical School and Training College in 1950. In 1972, when the political situation was very uncertain, it was thought best to have a nationalist head, and the very capable fellow worker, Kathy Talil, took over. Hazel was then loaned by the mission to become a head of a new school on the outskirts of Beirut, which was being started with the support of a group of national Christians. It seemed to be an ideal area where Christians, Muslims, and Druze were keen to send their children, even though the schools were known to be giving Christian teaching. It grew from 140 in 1973 to nearly 500 in 1975. And then the war broke out. It was in a very dangerous position, right in the middle of some of the most serious fighting. For 4 terms, they managed to open for only a very short periods. 2 members of the staff were killed by stray bullets. A child was murdered on the way to school. Another shot through the shoulder in the school bus. Many nights were spent on mattresses down in the basement. But by January of 1977, things were quieter, and the school started again more normally, though by frequent disturbances and far worse fighting to come later on. Hazel's wartime adventures could fill a volume. 2 I remember especially. One night in June of 1976, she had tried to leave East Beirut, and she was staying in the blind school building in West Beirut. The American ambassador had been murdered in the street that week, and a great deal of fighting was going on. She was alone that night on the 3rd floor, sleeping as very often on the floor to avoid bullets through the window. It was a current joke in Beirut that the ideal home was one large passage with no windows, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. A car bomb had went off in the street below, and a neighboring building was hit. It seemed as if things were all collapsing with a deafening noise all around. She prayed for protection and then to try and drown the uproar. She switched on a battery radio on the floor beside her. There was no electricity at that time. With a 2-hour difference, she struck the BBC 8:30 hymn singing, and a voice rang out clear and strong in the dark, without any introduction. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, I give unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. It was a Sunday evening service from a little Welsh chapel where we had once worshipped on holiday. It seemed exactly as if the Lord himself stood in the room. The words were calming and strengthening then, and on many other occasions. She traveled out of Lebanon 2 days later over the mountains in the funeral cortege of the American ambassador, the only chance of leaving for some time, and remained at home until New Year 1977, when a skeleton school reopened. On another occasion, at the end of the school year in 1978, there was a party to which the top class had been invited to celebrate the birthday of a Druze girl who lived in another village. Things had been quieter on the whole, and some of the parents were willing for their teenagers to attend with several of the staff. Hazel had refused, as someone was shortly leaving for England and she wanted to send letters home. She was sitting on the veranda, hard at work, when a voice spoke. You ought to be at that party. She was startled, but argued to herself that it was impossible, as she had lent her car to another teacher and the house was some little distance away. But the voice seemed to speak again. You ought to be at that party. The conviction was so strong that Hazel could not ignore it. She went to the flat above and knocked. The owner's daughter was in the bath, but she appeared quite soon and agreed to lend her a car. Hazel was hailed enthusiastically, and the party seemed a merry one. Why had she come? She wondered as she ate a bowl of trifle and chatted with a friend. Then suddenly the happy noise stopped dead. She looked up. Round the walls were several gunmen, one of them pulling out the telephone wires. Another had the terrified children covered. Muslims and Druze over that side, Christians against that wall, here. One lad escaped under a bed and was found some time later, but the other 6 boys, white and silent, obeyed. It was a planned attack to capture 2 16-year-old lads who had been out at night with the militia. They were seized and hurried outside along with the other boys to a waiting truck, an almost certain death, it seemed. But not without protest. The hostess was furious. To enter her house and arrest her guests was an unspeakable breach of hospitality. And she charged the truck, telling them what she thought of them, and Hazel, who now knew why she had been summoned, followed her. Together they forced an entrance, and the soldiers, bewildered and surprised by these determined women, were thrown off guard. The truck roared off towards the mountains with a gun sticking out of the roof. Their superiors would know what to do. They were bundled out of the entrance of the small arsenal under the road, a kind of secret military headquarters. The boys were pushed into an inner room, and the uninvited ladies slipped in behind. Even as she entered the room, Hazel's heart lifted, for sitting at the table was the father of one of her students. He was acutely embarrassed at the sight of her, because after all she was his daughter's headmaster, and he acknowledged her politely. They took the two older boys into another room, and the ladies barged in too. Not all the might of the military with their guns could stop them. In fact, from the point of view of these soldiers, the situation was hopeless. These boys were questioned, threatened, and released because nobody had the temerity to execute them or even sentence them to death in front of these impossible women. Though sadly one of the two was shot and killed a short time after, for the moment all was well. They were bundled back into the truck. Two enormous officers wanting a lift sat in on top of them, and they roared their way back to the house, where the parents of the boys and all their friends were now wailing and moaning, beating their breasts, having heard the news. And when the boys tumbled out of the car, the demonstrations of joy were as violent as their demonstrations of grief had been. I stayed with Hazel for 5 weeks, doing odd jobs and attempting to drive her when necessary through the terrifying Beirut traffic, where on a double carriageway drivers might get impatient at the frequent military checks and roadblocks and charge right across the barriers, hooting violently, with cars streaming towards them. Our conversation was frequently as follows. Hazel, quick, who has the right-of-way? No one, Patricia. It's the one who gets there first. Hurry, Hazel, we can't get up there. It's one way. Oh, but it's where we want to go, and the other road is blocked. Go on, see what happens. Somehow we always got through unhindered, once with a soldier walking ahead of us to ensure safe passage. These trips to town scared me stiff, but there were other trips which were pure delight. Trips up into the unspoiled Lebanese mountains, where the vineyards were turning crimson, where green grass and autumn crocuses were springing up with the first freshness of rain in the dry slopes. Here you could turn and look out beyond a ruined city to the misty blue of the Mediterranean. Often at this time of year, great double rainbows spanned the coast from Tyre in the south to Tripoli in the north. We climbed to the cedars, visited fascinating little mountain villages. It was a paradise of a country, and it seemed incredible that down below its own people were systematically and deliberately destroying their own glory. Apart from the driving, my presence was not very necessary. Hazel had an excellent staff, and she leaped around on her crutches like an animated kangaroo. But to me the visit was a sheer gain. There was a temporary lull in the fighting, and the courage and determination of the population to arise from the ruins and start life again was something moving and inspiring. I also made the acquaintance of Faith Willard from the States, with whom our lives were to become so linked together from then on until now. Faith, some years previously, had come as a young woman on a trip to Beirut and been introduced to Hazel. It was a brief meeting, and Hazel did not remember it. But Faith went back to the States to rethink her future. She was highly qualified, highly skilled counselor in a large state school. She had glimpsed another kind of life, and after a few years she wrote and applied to work on the staff of the school in Lebanon. Hazel read the glowing testimonies and credentials and decided against. It would be like imprisoning a golden eagle in a bird cage. She thanked her for her letter, but explained that she did not feel that she would fit in. Faith was puzzled. She was sure that God had spoken to her, and it seemed strange that he had not spoken to Hazel. She wrote again and received the same reply. Nothing daunted, Faith tried the third time, assuring Hazel that she had been called to the post. Hazel gave in, but wrote cautiously, pointing out the difficulties and uncertainties in education in a land at war. Faith telegraphed back, "Hallelujah, I'm coming." Her coming was certainly a great blessing, both in the school and the neighborhood, where she started a Bible study attended by parents and friends. It was her enthusiasm and desire to share God's Word which encouraged Hazel to join her and Heather, a young teacher, on Saturday after I left, in giving out to the foreign troops stationed in Lebanon several thousand Gospels, supplied through the Bible Society. The three of them drove happily in the ancient VW from one end of the country to the other, past frequent checkpoints manned by Syrians, Yemen, and the Saudi Arabian soldiers. The soldiers were always surprised, usually polite, and often eager for something to read that would relieve the monotony on the roads where few cars passed. Several soldiers would ask for several copies for my family in Damascus or Homs. At intervals were large military camps with sentries at the entrance. The three would say that they wanted to speak to the commanding officer, and the soldiers, taken aback at seeing 3 foreign women, 2 of them very attractive with long golden hair, and the third, an older woman on crutches. The badge of respectability would allow them through. In a central tent, the officers would be lounging around, drinking coffee, and again, startled at seeing 3 foreign ladies, they would offer seats order more coffee, and start to talk. Not once did they refuse books themselves, and usually out of politeness, the Syrian officers would agree to some books being given out in the camp. There were no spectacular results to report, but God's promise holds. My word shall not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. Back home again, I wrote Nothing Else Matters, a story based on the true experiences of a Lebanese family who had come to live with Hazel after losing their home and all their possessions in recent fighting. Tomorrow we'll be reading Chapter 23, Settling Down in England. I love you, I'm praying for you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.